Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about what is a miracle in A Course in Miracles. This is a really interesting topic, and Robert and I wanted to discuss it today because if you are a student of a book called A Course in Miracles, it's a good idea to know how the book itself defines what miracles are. And this is one of those things that sounds super basic, like we should all be on the same page about this, and yet there isn't a lot of consensus around this idea. And so, Robert, let's just get into it. I found the course in March of 2011. And I immediately did what every new student typically does. I started researching the course on the internet and on YouTube and whatnot, just looking for resources and teachers who could explain this thing to me. And what I heard at the time, and what students hear to this day, is that miracles are defined as a shift in perception. And so that just feels like a good place to start. So let's talk about miracles as defined as a shift in perception.
Well, I think your story is so representative because you get on this path, and I think you pretty quickly learn that the meaning of the word miracle is not the traditional meaning. And so then you think, well, what is the meaning of the word miracle here? And then everyone's there to tell you, well, a miracle is a shift in perception. And if everyone tells you, you think, sure. I think we all assume that there's going to be a lot of quotes in the book that say that, right? Turns out there aren't. And if you look in the book very carefully for where miracles are defined, you find there's a whole other teaching about miracles. And as we often say, the main meaning of the word miracle in the course is that a miracle is an expression of love.
Right. So miracle is defined as an expression of love in Miracle Principle 3, where that exact language is used. But the miracle principles themselves don't use the language shift in perception. So where did we get that idea as students?
That's a really good question. There's nowhere in the course where a miracle is defined as a shift in perception or miracles are defined as shifts in perception. There's just nowhere. And so where did it come from? I think there's a logical kind of conclusion that maybe was drawn that, well, this course is about the healing of perception. It's a course in miracles. So those two things must be the same thing. I've always suspected that it went way back to maybe Helen and Bill. I think it was so rooted in the course culture, and from what I could see so early on, that it must have gone back, I think, quite far. Helen and Bill, or Helen, Bill, Ken and Judy, just because, like, how could it have gotten so widespread otherwise?
Yeah, because what you were saying earlier is true from my experience. When you hear miracles defined as a shift in perception, you feel like, okay, well, you hear it so much, you feel like that must be it. And so you're almost reading the miracle principles with that idea in mind. And when you do that, you miss the language of miracles defined as expressions of love, which are everywhere
Yeah.
in the principles themselves. And so, as I said in my introduction, as students of this path, we really should come to a consensus around the primary definition of miracles if we are collectively studying this book called A Course in Miracles. And I know that we're going to get into this a little bit more later, but it's worth mentioning now that if the course is your path, and the teaching about miracles is important enough that the book is called A Course in Miracles, then presumably we would want to get this right. And so if miracles are defined as expressions of love, that's going to send you in one direction. It's going to send you off into external behavioral expressions of love.
Mm-hmm.
And if miracles are defined as internal shifts in perception, then that's going to send you into a completely different direction where your path is going to be more internal and thought-based. And so, again, we should, as students, be very clear on this because we're talking about one path versus another here.
Oh, absolutely. It makes a huge difference. And because of how important it is, let me just talk a bit about the case for expressions of love. So, the first chapter originally, what's now the first chapter of the text, which is all about miracles. Okay, it's the 50 miracle principles. Only as originally dictated, it was a 20,000 word chapter. The FIP edition cut it down to 5,000 words, so a fourth of its original length. And the miracle principles were taken from, they originally were scattered all throughout those 20,000 words, and they were crunched into the opening section. And they're very cryptic. Okay, it's hard to know what they mean. The elaboration, the commentary that followed so many of them is gone. There's been some editing so that some of them, the editing sort of steers the principle toward a shift in perception kind of model. But anyway, if we go back to what Helen originally wrote down, there was a voluminous teaching on miracles. Okay. And right out of the gate, all throughout that first chapter, and then also there's a lot about miracles in chapters 2 and 3. All of that, almost all of it, treats miracles as interpersonal acts where one person expresses love to someone else. By my count, 48 of those 50 miracle principles talk about miracles in the expression of love model. 2 of them talk about miracles as something that happens inside of you, or miracles as inducing an internal shift. And, we'll say more about the case as we go forward. But here in those early chapters, especially chapter 1, which originally was so much longer, Jesus is laying the foundations, not just for miracles, but for the whole course. And if you read that material as originally dictated, there's no getting around it. Miracles are consistently referred to as interpersonal acts, an extension from one person to another.
It's wild how different the principles are when you put the content from Helen's notes back into them. It's amazing to think that it goes from 5,000 words in chapter 1 in the original publication to 20,000 words in the complete and annotated edition. And from that, you just get a fuller picture of what he means by miracles and what it means to be a miracle worker. He uses that language all the time, miracle worker. Well, working implies that you're doing something in the world.
Well, but can I just interject here quickly?
Yeah,
he also uses the terms miracle doer, as well as just the term doer, and also miracle receiver, as well as the term receiver. So he's talking about miracle workers and doers and miracle receivers. And it's obvious what all that suggests.
Right. And since we're on the topic of things that were cut, one of the things that was cut in the original publication is what was the opening line of A Course in Miracles, which is, you will see miracles through your hands, through me. And so seeing miracles through your hands, through me, implies behavior and doing in the world too. So it was right there at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously for those who don't know, the me there is Jesus. So you're receiving miracles from him that you will then see coming from your hands. The fact that they come from your hands, the fact that you see them, that's not a shift in perception picture there at all.
Now that we're talking about miracles as behavioral expressions of love, let's just go through some of the principles that reinforce this idea. So you mentioned that miracles are defined as expressions of love, like using that exact language in the Course 7 times. So let's just talk about some of those examples from the Course.
Yeah, I don't think we've mentioned that yet, but that's true. And there are 6
Maybe
places.
we just talk about it
We
so
talk
much
about
that
it so
I've
much. Yeah.
internalized it, but yeah.
Yeah. So there were 7 times where Jesus defined miracles as quote unquote expressions of love. One of those was in personal guidance, is not in the CE. 6 of those are in the CE. I think 5 of those, I believe, are in the FIP edition. So there's not a big mystery there. I mean, I can't think of any other terms in the Course that get defined in the exact same way over and over and over. And you see this, I'll just mention, as you said, some examples. In the very first miracle principles, originally the first 2 principles, as they were dictated, were meant to sound mysterious and raise a question in your mind. Okay, so, there is no order of difficulty in miracles. One miracle is not harder or bigger than another. Miracles in themselves do not matter. That's basically how the first 2 miracle principles originally read. So you're thinking, what? How can that be? And the third principle answers those first 2. It not only answers it, but then it says, this explains number 1. This explains number 2. So he specifically sees miracle principle number 3 as the explanation of the first 2. And number 3 says miracles occur naturally as expressions of love. So there is that first occurrence of the term expressions of love. Later in chapter 1, under principle 35, he says, just because miracles are expressions of love, it does not follow that they will always be effective. Later, much later in chapter 4 in the text, he says, I know that miracles are natural because they are expressions of love. Much later than that, in chapter 7 in the text, he says, we once said that there is no order in miracles because they are all maximal expressions of love. So you can see again and again, he's not just using the phrase expressions of love. He's saying miracles are expressions of love. And if he says it 7 times, we probably should pay attention. And I'm saying that with of course, but I missed this for so many years. I didn't start paying attention to the phrase expressions of love until the last 10 or so years. It's kind of crazy how long I didn't clue in on the repeated definition of miracles using that phrase.
Well, as we've been saying, if it's not just part of the culture, if it's not part of the water that we're swimming in as course students, then it can be easy to miss. But it's one of those things, though, that once you internalize miracles as expressions of love, then you start to see that everywhere. You kind of have to do some acrobatics to make shifts in perception work when you just keep your eyes on the page. But when you have that understanding of miracles as expressions of love, again, it's right there in Miracle Principle 3, and it only continues on from there. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about your own journey. I mean, that's interesting to me that you've been studying the Course for 40 years now, and it's just in the last 10 years that you've really gotten miracles as expressions of love. So that's 30 years where you didn't. So do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, I think, and I had never thought about this until today, about my journey to my current, position on miracles, because it's been really long and gradual. So way back in the 80s, I started studying the Course intensively and was noticing there's all this in here about how we extend to others. And somewhere in the 80s, I started making a collection about references to the word miracle and how those were framed. And I realized very quickly most of the references to miracle frame them as something that extends from me to you, right? From me to somebody else. So I realized all along that they were some kind of expression, an interpersonal extension, you could say, but I didn't really appreciate it. We did a workshop and then a book in the 90s, me and Alan Watson, on miracles. And I look back and think, what a muddle it all was in my head. I just was very muddled about the whole thing. I knew the term mainly referred to the extension, but still. And then what happened was I started to get a hold of that original material in the 2000s. And more, I realized, hang on, this is a bigger deal than I realized. He's giving this voluminous teaching, not just on how they're expressions of love, but all the details around it. How do you put yourself in a place to do that? How do you make sure you express love to the right people? What effect does it have on these people? What's the sort of what he calls the perceptual content of that behavioral extension? So there's a whole big detailed picture. And then I noticed that every time Jesus said something was a miracle, usually in Helen and Bill's lives, it was always an interpersonal act. And so all this sort of gathered steam very slowly in me. And now it's just transformed my picture of the course. It literally took decades, I think in part because I had soaked up the emphasis in the culture, even though I've been trying to correct it since the 80s. I still, I think, had soaked some of it in.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, it's given me a picture of the course, and we'll talk about this more before we're done, that's just qualitatively different.
Yeah, and the course is so new. It's only a 47-year-old path because it was published in 76. And so 46-year-old path. And so a lot of the work that you've done as a student has been, it feels, and an interpreter especially, feels like carving granite because you don't have the benefit of institutional knowledge or just the culture of being a course student where everybody's accepting of the same ideas.
Yeah.
It's like there's so many different ideas out there, and every teacher and every student seems to come to the table with what they believe is true. And that we talk about this a lot of time, often at the circle, where that's actually held the course back in the world. Because if we can't get on the same page about basic things like what a miracle is, then the course itself can't get traction and move forward in the world. And so that's why coming together on these ideas as a community is important for not only us as students so that we make progress on our path, but so that the course itself can make progress in the world.
Yeah, that's a whole issue that we could do a whole podcast on that issue. I think students love. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I think students tend to like the idea that it kind of means whatever it means to me, and therefore it means something different to all of us. But while I think we think we love that idea, it's bewildering how many different views of the course there are. Wouldn't it be great if we all could agree on some things? And the only way we're going to do that, unfortunately, is really by doing careful interpretive work. The only other way to come to our views is we get our inner guidance, we go with what feels right. And those methods, in my experience, always yield things that just disagree with what's on the page.
Can I just pick at that scab for a minute, though? Because one of the reasons why you and I both think that miracles as shifts in perception just took off like wildfire is because it's easier to think of miracles as just a change in your own mind than it is to accept that miracles are expressions of love and get out there and be loving in the world to people with whom you're holding unforgiveness and grievances. So it's harder to think of miracles as expressions of love. It's easier to think of them as shifts in perception. And so if it's easier to just reinforce something that we want to do anyway, then that's the thing that's going to spread. And that's what we've seen happen.
Yeah. And I mean, aside from it's easier, there's also just, if we're in the spiritual arena, we've been marinating for a long time in the idea that the quality of my consciousness is the only thing that matters. It's just about my mind. And I hope this isn't indulgent to tell this story. I mean, you know the story well. I was doing a few years back commentary on one of the early miracle principles where Jesus talks about how he wants to take charge of the minutiae in our lives so that he can speed us through it, so we'll have more time for what really matters, which is giving miracles. So that suggests that we make distinctions between trivial things, like Helen was shopping for a winter coat, and important things like making a difference in somebody else's life. And the miracle principle is miracles depend on timing. They depend on timing because people need you when they need you. It's not about your consciousness. It's about they need you right now. And so I was writing the commentary, and you know the story well. And so I wrote a paragraph that was meant to express what we expect it to say, but said the opposite of what it said. And the paragraph went something like, as you're facing your date, don't make distinctions between what's trivial and what matters. Don't say that shopping is less important than doing good in the world. If you're in the right state of consciousness, it's all a miracle. And what I found, in the next paragraph, I said, he's not saying this, but I think I've had to revise it twice since then because people so naturally think that sounds right. That's the truth. That I've had to revise the commentary a couple of times to say, alert, notice, this is the opposite of what's being said. As spiritual seekers, we think in terms of it's the quality of my consciousness. That's everything. And we think, don't make those distinctions between trivial stuff like shopping and important stuff like doing good in the world. And yet the Course is saying exactly that. Do make those distinctions because you're here to do good in the world.
Well, I'm kind of smirking because you're very generous in not saying that I was one of those people originally that was like, yeah, that sounds good. Like, got it totally wrong. And I think I was the one who read it originally. And I was like, that's really good. And you were like, did you get what I was saying there? And I was like, yeah. And you're like, no, actually, you didn't. Fix that.
I remember you quoted it. Is that what you're going to say?
Go ahead.
Well, you did a study guide where you pulled from my commentaries, but you didn't pull the whole commentaries because of length considerations. And you pulled
it totally wrong.
You pulled that part, that one paragraph, as like the representative of the whole commentary. I'm like, no.
Good. Well, that wasn't the first time that you were like, no, oh my God. All right. So back to the idea of miracles as, the idea that miracles are shifts in perception. So that phrase, I'm going to try and get to the bottom of why this is so sticky. That phrase, shifts in perception, does appear in the Course, but it only appears 3 times. So you and I looked this up earlier today, and I thought that specific phrase appeared more. And you were like, I don't think it appears very often. And we looked it up. It's 3 times in the whole Course compared to expressions of love appearing 7 times. But miracles are never defined as a shift in perception. Right. Did you want to say something? I feel like you're like,
it's shifts in perception, plural, isn't found in the Course. Mm-hmm. The singular shift is, as you're saying 3 times, but you're right. That phrase is never even associated with miracles, let alone given as the definition of miracles.
That's what I wanted to draw out. So shifts in perception does occasionally appear in the course. There's even a section called shifts in perception, but that phrase is never associated with the definition of miracles. And that's something that I think we should be very clear on as students.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, so you were saying earlier that 48 of the 50 miracle principles directly state or imply that miracles are expressions of love. That leaves two left over. And of those two, they do imply that miracles are internal shifts, but not in the way that we think. So the course calls the miracle not the shift itself, but the catalyst for the shift. And so I've always found that distinction to be really interesting. You've, I think, found it more of like a nuance point, but I want to draw it out because it's just worth noting as students as well.
Yeah. So the best way perhaps to talk about it is from principle 37, where the miracle as an internal event is first introduced. And that is part of the course, but it comes in first in principle 37. And he says, a miracle is a correction factor introduced into false thinking by me. And I think the next sentence says it acts as a catalyst, breaking up false perception, snapping it into place or something like that. So there, the miracle is not the shift, it's the correction factor or catalyst that brings about the shift, as if there's something that Jesus does in the mind or the Holy Spirit does in the mind that is the miracle, and the result of that is the shift in perception.
So it's not the shift itself, it's the thing that happens before the shift. That's what he calls the miracle in those two miracle principles, right?
Yeah, I mean, the second one, I think, is principle number 50. I think it's the last one. And it doesn't use any of that language, but it does imply that miracles act in your own mind, whereas the rest of the principles act as if miracles are interpersonal extensions from you to someone else. But I just want to highlight how different that is from the rest of the chapter 1 teaching on miracles, because Jesus highlights that. Okay, so a few principles later, under principle 41, he originally was talking about Bill and Bill's sense of feeling like apart from everyone and lacking in worth. And so Jesus said to Bill, you must heal your perception in this respect. He says, you must work a miracle on behalf of yourself here. So that's clearly an internal kind of miracle. And then in parentheses, Jesus says, see the principle about miracles as perception correctors. So he's specifically singling out that one principle. Then he says, so if you take the parentheses out, he says, you must work a miracle on behalf of yourself here before you can extend miracles as creative energizers, which they are. So he's talking about, the idea of an internal miracle, but he's saying you have to do that internal thing before you can extend miracles as creative energizers, and that's what they are. So even here, you can see how he sees those two different kinds of miracles. His emphasis is on the extension.
Yeah, and I feel like we're probably getting a little in the weeds with the teaching on this one, but that idea in Miracle Principle 37 that the miracle is a correction factor introduced into false thinking by him is amazing, because it means that he's coming into our mind, correcting our thinking so that we can go on to be miracle workers in the world to express love. And so just what an amazing idea. So let's talk about how these two ideas are related. So we're not saying that miracles aren't shifts in perception, we are saying that miracles are primarily defined as expressions of love in the Course, and that shifts in perception is a secondary definition. But these things are related. And oftentimes, one of the things that students will say is, don't you have to have that shift in perception before you can express love? In other words, don't you have to get your mind right to be loving to another person? And so, what do you have to say, Robert, about how these two definitions interact with each other?
Yeah, well, we kind of just saw it in the whole thing about Bill. Like he was, it says, you must work a miracle on behalf of yourself here before you can extend miracles as creative energizers. And we see the same point made under Miracle Principle 46 a little bit later. I want to read this quote. The distinction has also been made here, meaning he's already made it, between miracle mindedness as a state and miracle doing as its expression. There's the word expression. The former, the state, needs your careful protection because it is a state of miracle readiness. This is what the Bible means in the references to hold yourself ready and other similar injunctions. So he's really saying that if you're going to do miracle doing, the outward expression of love, you need to be miracle minded. And for in the most simple terms, how can you give love unless you have love? If you don't have love, your expression of love is going to be fake, right? It's going to be something that looks loving, but contains no actual love. But one point to make about that is he's not saying that you go around waiting for your mind to shift about someone and then you give that person a miracle. He's wanting you to keep your mind miracle minded at all times. He's wanting you to be constantly guarding your thoughts so that you are constantly miracle ready, because you never know when you'll come upon someone who needs a miracle. So when you give a miracle, it's not dictated by your shift, it's dictated by their need. We've gotten so into ourselves as spiritual seekers that we've lost sight of some of these basic things, like they have a need. Okay. And so we should be walking around in that state of miracle mindedness so that we're always ready to give the miracle. Because how can you give a miracle unless you have miracle mindedness within yourself?
And this is where you start to see the interconnectedness of not only the miracle principles themselves, but the whole course. There's a miracle principle that says prayer is the medium of miracles. Through prayer, love is received, and through miracles, love is expressed. And so that feels like something very connected to what you're saying. We're using prayer, and later on, we'll learn to use the workbook to keep our minds in that miracle ready state so that we are available to express love when love is needed.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, that early principle, the whole idea there is that in prayer, you kind of fill up with love from God so that you can then express that love to others.
I just want to put in a little plug for the app because I sound really smart right now, but all I'm doing is like it clicked in my head. I was like, yeah, I think that's like the miracle principle about prayer. And I looked it up quickly and then just said it. So for anyone who wants a searchable version of the completed annotated edition, go to acimce.app. And I hate to put a plug for our app. It's free, but I hate to put a plug right in the middle of this podcast, but I'm just finding it so helpful in our conversations and in these podcasts to just have it right here where you're thinking, oh, what did that say again? And then you can look it up and it's right at your fingertips. So anyway, back to commercial over, back to our podcast. Another point that Jesus makes, and there are over a dozen places where Jesus notes that miracles, like he calls things miracles. And these are mostly examples from the lives of Helen and Bill. And what's interesting to note is that every time Jesus calls something a miracle, it's an interpersonal expression. And so let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I started to notice this back in the 90s when Absence from Felicity came out, Ken Wapnick's story of Helen Schuckman's life, which contained all this, dictation from Jesus that had not been seen before the book came out. And he would just call something a miracle, and I'd say, that's a miracle? And so many years later, like I think in 2013 or something, I collected as many of those stories as I could find. I think I pulled together like 14, where he called something or clearly implied that something was a miracle. And every single one of those is an interpersonal kind of miracle. There is no miracle as an internal shift or even the catalyst for an internal shift. So, there are 14 examples. Just one example that I'll mention here is in, I think our cameo 5 is called the Shield Report. And in that cameo, what Helen did, Jesus gives a miracle principle and says a great example of this was when. So at some time previous, we don't know when, this incident happened where a colleague of Helen's had written a grant proposal, a report on this place that still exists to this day called the Shield Institute. And Helen thought the report was really poorly done and therefore would jeopardize them getting the funding that they were seeking from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. So Helen rewrote the report in her name. She didn't put her own name on it. And the funding was acquired. The grant was accepted. And so we might think, well, Helen, you're buying into the illusory nature of the world there. You're thinking that these things are real. But Jesus thought something very different. He said it was a miracle. And he didn't just imply it. Let me just read a couple of quotes here. He says, the reason it was a miracle was because it not only atoned for Esther, the original author of the report, but also for you, because it kept the children from harm. She apparently, in some distant past life, had hated and hurt the children. And the Shield Institute served and serves developmentally disabled children. So by writing a better report, she was keeping the children from harm. He also says, if you had known that you were really performing a miracle for the Shield, for Esther, for yourself, and for me, you would have done it with real joy. So and there's like 4 times where he says what she did in rewriting that report was a miracle. Well, it wasn't a miracle because she was having some great shift. He says she actually rewrote the report resentfully. But it was an expression of love. He says it was an expression of her love for that organization. And so it was a miracle. And there's story after story after story like this, all of them in the same mold. And that has to affect us.
Yeah, another example is Mrs. Albert, which is another cameo in the back of the CE. And I just did a little video on Mrs. Albert, and you said that Mrs. Albert is the person, aside from Helen and Bill, that Jesus gives the most praise to. And what he says to Helen and Bill is, look carefully at Mrs. Albert. She's working miracles every day. And the way that she worked miracles was just living her life without embarrassment or hostility and standing for what she believed in. But she's just an example of the interpersonal nature of miracles that Jesus calls miracles.
Yeah. Well, I think what I probably said was that she gets the most unambivalent praise of anyone except probably Jesus. Helen and Bill get praise at times, but it's mixed in with a lot of pointing out their shortcomings. And Freud got a certain amount of praise, but he got a lot of criticism as well. Mrs. Albert just gets praise. And the miracle that she did that's pointed out as a miracle was where Helen and Bill are apparently at the bedside of a mutual friend who's dying. He's got brain cancer, he's terminal, and he will die shortly. And Mrs. Albert, without testing the waters with Helen first to see if Helen would, welcome a comment like this, she said, well, you have to preserve, Dave's life as long as you can, because you never can tell when God will come and say, get up, Dave.
Get up.
He will. And Jesus said, rather than asking if Helen believed in such things first, she merely followed it up with, and it's true too. And so we can assume that she wasn't being a kind of a pushy, busybody Christian, that she was in an innocent way, strongly expressing her convictions that God can heal anything, even terminal cancer. And you can imagine that Jesus would approve of that because that's the first principle of miracles, basically. And so he very clearly implied that by saying that with such innocent conviction to Helen, Mrs. Albert was working a miracle. Why? Because she was causing something to shift inside Helen's mind. And so there again, you have the miracle as an interpersonal act.
I wasn't going to get into all that, but since you did,
I think we have time.
Yeah, I think we do as well. But the point is, when Jesus is like, look carefully at Mrs. Albert, she's working miracles every day. It's like, look carefully at what she's doing, because she's behaving in ways that she's a miracle worker.
You can see miracles through her hands. They aren't also invisible mental shifts.
I just want to, since we do seem to have a little bit of time, and you mentioned the very first miracle principle, I just want to share this. I hope this isn't an indulgence too, but when you think of miracles as a shift in perception, or when you think of anything, what tends to happen with the Course, what tends to happen is you take what's already in your mind and put it on the page, regardless of whether that's what the page says or not. And the first miracle principle is an example of that for me. And I'll just share this since we're outing Emily was naive stories. The first principle is there's no order of difficulty in miracles. Now, when I was thinking that miracles were a shift in perception, I was actually challenging you on this at the beginning of our relationship, when I was like, so if a miracle is a shift in perception and there's no order of difficulty in miracles, then that means I can think of cancer the same way that I think of like peeling this banana that's right in front of me. Like it's I can just think, if I shift my thinking, then I can approach whatever difficulty I'm facing in my life with positivity and with love, because I'm just shifting my thinking around it. And you were like, yeah, that's not accurate. and
weren't we doing some kind of interview or something? Or
what's funny, but I probably should post the clip of this with the show notes, because I said something very similar to what I've just said. Like, isn't it just a shift in my own perception? So I can think of cancer the way that I think I used the example candy. And you said, that's not only not my take, because I said, is that not your take? And you said, that's not only not my take, but it's not accurate. And I had like coffee. I thought I was going to spit it out because it was so funny the way that you said it, because it was just so deadpan. But anyway, the point is, just to be careful with these things, because once the groove gets laid down in your mind, and you think that something is a certain way, you start to read into the Course that it is that way when it may not be accurate. And so all of what I just shared was to make that point. And so with miracles, again, if we don't get this right, then we're not helping ourselves in our journey. We're not helping the Course. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, well, I think that you said this earlier, but I'll just say a bit more about it. if this is a Course in Miracles and you think, oh, a miracle is an internal shift, then this is a course in internal shifts. And that is absolutely the way the vast majority of course students see it. If you think this is a Course in Miracles and miracles are mainly expressions of love, then you think, oh, this is a course teaching me how to go around expressing love. So this is a course that is now inherently interpersonal, right? It's now inherently behavioral. That's a whole different course. That's a whole different path than what we've been thinking.
Yeah. And again, you're going in two different directions. And so if you're thinking that a miracle is just a shift in your own perception, and it's not about behavior, and it's not about getting involved in the world, it's just about changing your mind about the world, then you're on one path. And if you think that miracles are about expressions of love and getting out there and rolling up your sleeves and being an active worker, a miracle worker in the world, you're on a different path. And so we just have to get really clear about this, because we want to be on the same path. And I think that story that I just shared about miracle principle number 1 is really telling, because God, now that we're still on these things, like I wrote a whole book, Miracles at Work, about not getting out there and changing your workplace through love. I mean, there was some of that in there, but it was about, we were talking about this today, which is why it's up for me, changing your mind about your workplace. Now, I'm laughing about this now, but that's actually a really serious thing. That's a really serious thing. You are just sitting back and watching the chaos going on all around you at work, and you're just trying to accept that your job is to shift your thinking about it so that you can, have peace in your mind, or your job is to get out there and be loving and heal. And so I regret some of the things that I picked up as an early course student, and I'm on a campaign to help others not make those same mistakes.
Well, it's great that you're so willing to look at that and revisit it. I mean, it reminds me of that place in chapter 1, which is partially in the FIP edition, but the full version is in the CE, where he says, you have to listen to my voice, learn to undo error, and do something to correct it. Then he says, the first 2 are not enough. The real members of my party are active workers. So he's basically saying, if you just listen to my voice and learn to undo the errors inside yourself, that's not enough. You're not a real member of my party until you're an active worker.
And isn't that restored text, or was that in the original publication?
The first part of
the original publication.
Yeah, but the last part of it, the first 2 are not enough, the real members of my party, that was edited out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wait, say that again. So it could, so what was originally there was listen and undo, listen, learn, and undo, but not the active worker part?
Yeah, it was listen, learn, and do. Listen to my voice, learn to undo error, and do something to correct it. Okay. But you don't know what do something to correct it means. And that's the end of it. The part about the first 2 are not enough, the real members of my party are active workers, that was taken out. And I think a lot of students have seen that in other editions, not just the CE, and thought, whoa, that's huge.
That is huge, because if we wonder why we got it so wrong, if we wonder why we're not out there being active workers and loud about miracles as expressions of love and getting out there and healing, it's because we didn't have all the words.
Yeah.
Okay, so
can I just say something here? I think that we've been really talking a lot about what does the course teach? And I hope that we've established, as clearly as someone can in this kind of a format at this length, that the course is very clear that miracles are mainly expressions of love. But having made that clear, I think the next step is we need to embrace that. We need to not apologize for that. We need to see that in really, really glowing terms. So I know we want to talk more about that, but I just want to put a big accent mark on it before we get started.
Well, why don't you expand on that? Because that does feel like a really big point and a natural tack on to where we've been. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you forget for the moment where the course community went over the last few decades and think traditionally, he's speaking about miracles against a traditional backdrop, right? And against that backdrop, miracles are these supernatural things that Jesus did, right? Where dead people were raised and people who had been sick for decades were instantly healed. If you think in those terms, miracles seem unattainable. And they also seem kind of almost like supernatural feats, right? Like these amazing paranormal feats. With this new definition, I think two things happen that are really key. One is that miracles become democratized. I mean, everyone can express love. Everyone. So everyone can do miracles. The second thing is, if you are trying to do God's work, your job is not so much to do some amazing supernatural feat. Your job is to give love. And even if you do a paranormal feat, if there's no love at the heart of it, then it's not an expression of love. And then in his book, it's not a miracle. So if you're trying to be a worker for God, work in God's plan, whatever, your job above all, your only job is to express love. And I think that's a really important reframe of the whole concept of miracle.
Yeah. And you are reminding me, see, I don't need the app if I have you around. What is the principle that talks about miracles as inducing spectacle is wrong?
Oh, yeah. It's like 10 and 11, I think, somewhere in there. Yeah, I think it's like
So
10.
he even says in the principles that if you're working miracles to create belief, like a spectacle to induce belief, that's the wrong use of them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that feeds into what you're saying, because when you hear the word miracle, you think of it as something really spectacular, something grand that defies natural and scientific laws. And here again, it's just an ordinary expression of love to another person. And
Yeah.
as you just said, it democratizes it so anyone can do it. So
Yeah.
that this very thing that Jesus is praising and saying, look at this person doing this thing in the world, it's not some super spectacular, revelatory, spiritual thing. It's a simple expression of love. That's what he's praising. And it's such high praise that he names his book after it.
Yeah. And the
So
other thing that comes out of that is because everyone can do this and everyone can do this all day long, he's given us a new vision of what our lives should consist of. There's a well-known miracle principle that says each day should be devoted to miracles. Well, all of us used to read that as each day should be devoted to shifts in perception. But that is absolutely not what that means. The idea of the internal miracle has not been introduced yet. Okay. All that he's talking about here is expressions of love. So what he's saying is you're supposed to devote every day to expressing love to the people you encounter. He's given us a different vision of what a human life should be. And I think that it's a life that the whole course is there to make possible. You can't do that unless you do a lot of work on the inside, right? It's also a picture of a life that's far more fulfilling. You and I often mention how there's all this social science research these days that shows that the givers are the happy people, right? It's the people who are constantly giving that end up being fulfilled and happy and leading meaningful lives. He's laying out a roadmap here to having a happy, fulfilled, meaningful life. And so that's a way bigger thing than nailing down the fact that the course does teach that. This is seeing the value of why the course teaches that.
Mm. Well, we're running out of time, and I feel like I want to clarify something. I
Hmm.
get into a bit of trouble whenever I downplay the importance of heightened spiritual states in the course. Um, and so I just want to say that similar to what we said all throughout the recent series we did on the 10 traits of the spiritually advanced from the Manual for Teachers, we said repeatedly in all 6 of those episodes that the course is interested in the development of character, and the course considers the development of character and spiritual development to be the same thing. And so if you're looking for those heightened spiritual states, you get there from the course's perspective by developing your traits, like being a good person. And this whole conversation around miracles feels like such a reinforcement of that idea. He's not referring to miracles as these super spectacular things in the way that we define them. He's referring to them as simple expressions of love. And so the course itself doesn't downplay the heightened spiritual states. It talks about revelation, that direct experience with God. It talks about meditation and guidance and whatnot. But it's just so fascinating to me what it is that he's really trying to ingrain in our everyday. And it's every day should be devoted to miracles. It's simple expressions of love. Again, as you say, very, very attainable. And who wouldn't want that from their spiritual path? Something
Yeah.
attainable that is just helping us to become good people in the world. And being good people in the world is how you reach advanced spiritual states and heightened spiritual development. So I love that.
And vice versa. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we seek out those states because they help us reach that goal of being that good person. I mean, the main heightened state he's trying to get us to have through forgiveness is that state called vision, where you have a higher perception of other people and of their innocence and their worth. That's a spiritual state. It's not just a mental concept. And it's that heightened perception of other people that is the real rocket fuel that powers the miracle.
Yeah. Okay. So I know we're at the top of the hour, but I do want to draw that out because that feels like a really important point. When in the miracle principles, he's talking about being a miracle worker in the world and expressing love to other people. He is asking us to do that on the back of seeing them a certain way. And it's expressing love to those people, not because of some specific characteristic of theirs or anything about their body that we love. We're expressing love to them because we see the truth in them. We see the holiness in them. And that's the basis of our miracle working. And that's
Right.
vision.
Right.
And so I'm so glad that you brought that point out because that does feel very important.
Yeah, I mean, all this work on the inside, the course has us do a lot of work on the inside. If you do the workbook, you're doing a lot of work. Like if
Mm-hmm.
you actually follow the instructions, all that work on the inside is to get us to this place where we are miracle minded. And as he said in that quote that we saw, miracle mindedness then gets expressed in the form of miracle doing.
It's not that we're expressing love because we have specific love for a specific person. Therefore, we are just more loving to the people in our lives who we already love. It's we are seeing everyone through the lens of the holiness in them, what the Course calls vision. And that's the basis on which we love. And that's the basis for are miracles, which are
Yeah.
expressions of love. So
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you brought that out, because that does feel big.
Yeah. So we don't want to denigrate change perception. We don't want to denigrate the importance of our consciousness and our state of mind and our perception. But there's a fuller picture here. We do that inner work, and that leads to a function in the world where we're devoting our days to expressing love to others and thereby shifting their perception, right? And thereby contributing to the salvation of the world. It's not that it's one or the other, they both have to go together.
That is a good place to end. But that's an excellent point, Robert, because I don't want anyone to feel like we are putting down the shifts in perception or saying that it's any less important. What we're saying is that it's not the primary definition of miracles in the Course in Miracles.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, as always. And thank you to those of you who are here joining us live. If you'd like to attend a future broadcast of Exploring A Course in Miracles, just go to circleofa.org/events, and you'll find the link there, or the way to sign up for the link there. It's free, and we hope to see you in a future broadcast soon. Thanks so much for watching or listening, and bye for now.